everyone, and welcome back to the Interaction System series on Player Foundry. In this episode, we're going to expand our system to support hold to interact interactions. This will be complete with a UI progress bar that fills up as you hold the key, and once the bar reaches 100%, we'll fire off the interaction automatically. By the end of this video, you'll have a single reusable prompt that adapts to both single presses and timed holds. So let's get started. And here we are back in the project where we've been building our interaction system. To give our prompt a little bit more flexibility, both visually and functionally, we're going to have to expand its layout before we add any new logic. This is going to start with resizing the prompt. So in the content browser, navigate to the UI folder inside of our interaction system and open the WBP_interaction prompt blueprint. In the designer tab, simply select the root component from the hierarchy and then set its size for 300 by 60. And then you can compile and save and close back to the main editor. So what this is going to do for us is just give us that little bit more room on the widget to tell a player, like, you know, they can press to interact or they can hold to interact. And we're going to be building that out in this video, but we just wanted to create that little bit of room for it. Okay, so now that our widget is a little larger, we need to update the draw size on every interactable so that it matches. So open up the blueprints directory, and then within that, open up the BP_interactable file. Inside of that, search for the initialization function, and within there, find the set draw size node. We want to change that now to have 300 by 60, so that we match the dimensions that we just changed on the widget a moment ago. And with that, we can now compile, save, and close back to the editor. Okay, so now would be a good time to start thinking about adding our hold progress indicator, which will tell users or players exactly how much longer they need to hold the interact button in order to trigger the interaction. So the first thing we want to do is actually navigate into that UI directory inside of our interaction system, and then just open the Interaction Prompt Widget blueprint. And then in the palette in the top left, search for progress bar. From there, you can simply drag it into the hierarchy so that it sits between the background image and your text block. Then you can go ahead and rename it to something sensible like interaction progress. Then just make sure that you're making it fill the container, both vertically and horizontally. And then in the styling section, change the draw as value to none. This removes any default border and lets your background show through. And then if we mess around with the percent value, we'll be able to kind of see what it'll look like as the player holds that button eventually as we continue to implement this. Okay, from here, you can just compile and save, and then close back to the main editor. Okay, so now it's time to give ourselves a way to switch between a simple press interaction and a hold interaction. We're going to use an enumeration for this, which is a custom data type that defines a fixed set of named values, making your logic clearer and less error prone, and you can just switch on which one you're setting for a given interactable, and then make your code follow different logic based on which one you're using. So navigate to the blueprints directory inside of the interaction system folder and right click in the content browser. Go to blueprints and then select enumeration. Name the new asset E_interaction type. Now you can just double click on that to open it up, and in the Enum editor you'll see an empty list. This is where we can declare each individual type that we want to work with. So click add enumeration twice to add the new entries, and then add one called simple and one called hold, and then give them sensible descriptions. Basically, the simple one is a press wants to interact type, and the hold is one that says like hold down the interactable button to like make the interaction happen. And now you can just hit save and close the Enum editor. And with that interaction type Enum defined, you now have a solid reusable way to tell your system whether a given interactable should respond to a quick tap or to a timed hold. Next up, we'll wire all this Enum logic up to our interactable type so that they can adapt the behavior and adjust the UI dynamically. And to be able to do that dynamic UI behavior, we need to be able to get a reference to it from within the various parts of our interaction system, which we can do by first off opening up the BP_interactable blueprint and navigating to the render interaction prompt function. This is where we'll cache our widget reference for dynamic UI updates. First thing we want to do is make some room for some new nodes. So locate that create WBP_interaction prompt node and then select everything to the right of it, including the old routing node and the set widget calls and everything, and drag them further to the right. This creates room for our new variable, which we'll be setting in a moment. Okay, so after you've done that, we can break the wire connecting the create widget node's return value to the set widget. And then we can drag out from that return value pin on the create widget node and choose promote to variable. Name that new variable something sensible like interaction prompt reference. This gives us a handle on the widget instance so we can update it later. So now you should see that new set interaction prompt reference node. Go ahead and connect the execution flow so that it runs after the widget is created, but also check that you're executing the branch node afterwards as well. So then after that, you can drag out from the blue return value pin on this set node and then hook that up to the widget input on the original set widget node that was here before we got started. And then this ensures that the set widget call still has the correct widget, but now it's pulled from our new variable. Finally, we can delete the old routing node because it's now obsolete. And with these changes, every time we render the prompt, we store its widget instance in an interaction prompt reference variable, enabling us to tweak its text, progress bar, or other properties dynamically in later steps. And now on the left, you can just make that interaction prompt reference variable a public variable. Just click the little I to make it public, and then you can compile, save, and close back to the main editor. Okay, so the next thing we're going to want to do is set up the logic for both the progress bar and the dynamic text so that it'll work when we make the changes in the interaction system shortly. In the content browser, go ahead and open up the WBP_interaction prompt blueprint and switch to the graph editor. And then on the left, you can go ahead and add a new function and change its name to set progress. And once you're inside that, go ahead and go to the details panel on the right, and under inputs, click add to add a parameter named progress and change its type to float. So the next thing we want to do if we want to be able to actually set that value on the progress bar is get a reference to it. So on the left hand side, grab that interaction progress reference that we added earlier and just bring it into the graph and choose the get option. And then you can just drag off of the interaction progress pin and search for set%. And finally, just connect the entry point of the execution pin of the set progress to the set% node's execution input, and then drag the progress input pin from that node header and hook it into the in% pin on the set% node. So now that our widget is capable of updating its progress bar, we can initialize our widget and also the text so that it gets a bit more dynamic behavior upon creation within our game. Go ahead and switch to the event graph, and in there you should see the event construct node somewhere. This actually fires as soon as the widget is instantiated. Think of it as a blueprint widget's equivalent of a begin play event. And before we continue on, the next thing we're going to want to do is actually expose the text on our widget as a variable so that we can play around with its value. So switch over to the Designer tab and then select our text component. And then on the right-hand side, rename it to something like Interaction Widget Text. And then go ahead and check that checkbox for is variable, which basically exposes it as a value that we can change within our interaction prompt. And once you've done that, you can switch back to the graph editor view. And we'll be working with that text in a moment, but the first thing I also want to do is add our interaction type enum to this widget. So hit the plus button under variables on the left, add a new variable named interaction type, And then for its type, change that to E_interaction type. And upon that initialization, the first thing we want to do is set our current progress to 0. So let's go ahead and drag interaction progress in from the left again. And then you can just drag out from that and do a set % node. And then connect the event constructs execution flow to the set % node as well, but leave the in% as 0. This makes sure that the bar stays empty on initialization. And now in the blueprint panel on the left, you'll see a variable named Interaction Widget text. Drag the get for that out into the graph somewhere to the right of the set % node. Then from that Interaction Widget text node, drag out and add a set text node, the one at the bottom of the menu, not to be confused with other similarly named nodes. Then connect the execution pin from the set % node to the one on the set text nodes one so that it runs. And then we can start thinking about setting the values. Now, instead of hard coding some logic in here to set the values, we're actually going to do this a little bit more of a complicated but more dynamic way, where we will format the text to show a value based on information about our interactable object. So drag out from the in text pin on the set text node and search for format text. This node actually works very similar to the printf function in the C programming language, where you define a format string with placeholders and then feed in values, and it allows you to build up that string that you're looking for. So let's go ahead then and add our own placeholders to the format text node. In the format field of the format text node, just type interaction type text inside of curly braces like the video here shows, and that will create a parameter called interaction type text, which we can actually feed with a variable value from our game. And as you can see here, I actually have the E character in quotes and then to interact after our placeholder. And what that's going to do is give us the string with the interaction type text that we're about to populate, and then it will say E to interact. So our string would say something like press E to interact or hold E to interact, based on whatever type of interaction you're working with. And to make that happen, we're going to use a select node, which we can add by right-clicking on the graph and then searching for select. And then before we actually get stuck into that, let's talk about what a select node actually is. So a select node is essentially a multi-way branch. It takes an index input and returns one of several values based on that index. Think of it like a switch case statement in traditional code, where like if an index equals 0, it might return another value. And if an index equals 1, it would return a completely different value, and so on and so forth. You can have as many as you want. There is something we need to do to set it up for that first though, and that is right-click on the return value and change the type to a text type so that it's no longer a wildcard value. And then just go ahead and hook up that return value to the interaction type text value on the format text node. And then we can just go ahead and drag in that interaction type enum as a variable to our graph and hook it up to the index pin on our select node. And now in the text box beside simple, add the word press, and in the text box beside the word hold, add the word hold. This basically means that whenever we are working with this widget and the interaction type is simple, we're going to populate that formatted text to say press E to interact when it's a simple interaction type, and it's going to say hold E to interact for a hold interaction type. And lastly, just head over to the left and make that interaction type enum a public variable so that we can use it elsewhere in the game. And then over on the right, make sure that instance editable and expose on spawn are both checked. This means that we'll be able to mess with the values as we need to in our actual game. And then you can compile, save, and close back to the main editor, where we can start to hook up the actual way we're going to get all of these details to work. So head over to the interface class we created in the last video called BPI_interactable, and then add a function to that named getInteractionType. And then on the right, add an output and name it interaction type and make it the enum that we created before called E_interaction type. Then compile, save, and close back to the main editor again. And then head into our BP_door blueprint inside of the interactables directory and expand the interfaces section on the left. And you should now see that you have that get interaction type method that's coming from the interface that we're implementing here. Double click that to add it to our graph. And then for this door one, let's change that interaction type to hold. And then we can compile, save, and close back to the main editor. And now we're ready to hook up our enum driven text to the prompt. So navigate into the BP_interactable blueprint and open up the render interaction prompt function. Then you can just make some room for the new node by dragging the function entry point to the left a little bit so that there's some room between that and the create widget prompt. And then next, if you look at the create widget prompt itself, you should see that there's a new pin on there for interaction type. If it's not there, you can just right click on that node and hit the refresh node item in the menu and it'll appear. Now, what we want to do is actually populate that with the enum that we want from our current interactable. So drag out from that active interactable pin on the function entry and drag out and search for get interaction type. This is the getter for the enum you added before. So then you can drop that node between the entry and the create widget node and wire the execution flow so that it wires through the two of them like this. And then from there, you can just connect that output from the get interaction type node and plug it into the interaction type input on your create WBP interaction prompt node. Hit compile, save, close back to the main editor and hit play. And if you rock up to the door, you'll see that it should now say hold E to interact. Now, obviously the interact's not going to work. We haven't built that bit yet, but we're going to go and do that right now. And before we actually do that, I just want to double check our interaction on the third person enhanced input stuff to check that it's correct. So head over to third person, go to input, and then open up the actions directory and go to IA_interact and then expand the triggers and make sure that you've got the released value here in this dropdown and then 0.5 or so for that actuation threshold and then save and close. With all of that in place, let's wire up our input action to kick off the right behavior for each interaction type. So head on over to the BP_player interaction state blueprint and switch to the event graph. Find the enhanced input action IA_interact event. Disconnect its triggered pin from the existing logic and drag those old nodes down and out of the way. We're actually going to reuse them in just a moment. Now you can just right click on the graph below that and add a new custom event. And we're going to name that begin interaction. Now we want to make sure that that actually gets fired by our existing one. So head back up to IA interact and drag out from its triggered pin and search for begin interaction to add a call to your new custom event. Now, whenever the player presses or holds the interact key, it's going to fire and it'll immediately fire our begin interaction event. And we're about to start make that handle the different types of interactions. And then just come down to where you see that active interactable variable and drag out from it and add an isValid node to check if it's actually a valid interactable. And then go ahead and connect the begin interaction events execution pin to that isValid node's execution input. And then we can actually just go ahead and delete that interact node because we're going to want it again, but we'll just add it back when we need it once we've worked out the different logic for the press versus hold. Okay, so now we can drag out from the active interactable variable and add a get interaction type node. Connect the isValid from the execution pin of the isValid node to the getInteractionType node's input. Drag out the interaction type pin on the getInteractionType and add a switch so that we can now begin to have different behavior whenever we have different interaction types being processed. But before we do that, we're going to want to go back and add another custom event to the graph. So just right click and search for custom event. And let's call that new one trigger interaction. And then we can just go back to our switch statement and drag out from that simple pin and call our new trigger interaction event. And then we're just going to head back over to that event again. And then below that event, you can just drag in another active interactable variable from the left. And then from there, you can just drag out and add an interact call. Wire the trigger interaction to the interact, which essentially means that when we fire this trigger event, it's going to actually take our active interactable and run whatever interact code we have in there. To set up our hold to interact logic, we'll actually use event dispatchers. Now, I was going to get into explaining what event dispatchers were in this video, but I didn't want it to become an hour long, so I promise I'll make a video about it on the channel at some point, but for now, you can kind of think of it like a publisher or subscriber pattern that lets us have some part of our game that publishes events and other parts of our game that might subscribe to those events and take action when they happen. So anyway, on the left, we can just go over to event dispatchers and hit the plus button and add one and call it on hold interact. And then we can just move up to our IA interact event, and then we can drag out our on hold interact from the left panel and add it to the graph, and make sure to choose call from the menu that's going to appear when you go to drop it. Connect the ongoing execution pin from the IA interact event to the call on hold interact. Basically, what this means is for every frame the player is holding down the interact key, we're gonna keep firing our dispatcher. So with that done, we can head back down to the switch that we had earlier and drag out from that hold pin and search for bind to on hold interact. This creates a binding so we can respond whenever on hold interact fires. In the graph where you just bound the dispatcher, drag out from the new event on hold interact node's event pin and choose add custom event. Name this event handle hold interact. Which is great, but this actually is a interactable where we need to know how long the player has been holding the button so that we can actually fire the interactable. So on the left, select the on hold interact event dispatcher, and then on the right, you can add a new parameter. Just call that parameter elapsed seconds, and then give it a type of float. And then back in the graph, if you go up to the IA interact event, you can now drag from the elapsed seconds on there and connect it to the elapsed seconds on our call on hold interact node. And with that in place, every frame that the player holds the interact key, the on hold interact fires with how long they've held it, and the handle hold interact will receive that value, so we can drive our progress bar timing and ultimately trigger the interaction once enough time has passed. Let's start to build out that logic. So from the elapsed seconds pin on the hold interact event, just drag out and add a divide node. From there, you can just connect up the elapsed seconds to that tap pin And in the bottom one, type 1. Basically, we're going to divide this number by 1 to give us a more readable value within our logic. Now, in a little while, we're going to use this divide node to make our progress bar actually animate and work. But for now, let's go ahead and hook up the main event. To do that, you can simply drag another line out from the elapsed seconds on that event node and then add a greater than node. You can then set the second pin to 1 again, basically to check if the player has held this key for more than 1 second. Now, later on, we're going to make this configurable, but in this one, we'll hard code it for now. So now we need to check if the result of that was true or false. So just drag out from the greater than node and add a branch node. And then go back to the event and make sure to hook up the execution pin from the event to the branch's execution input. Basically, this means that each time that our dispatcher fires, we immediately test whether the hold exceeds 1 second. And that means that from the true pin of the branch, we can just call our existing trigger interaction event. And then after that, we can just drag out from there and add an unbind event from onHold interact node. And then hook up the event pin from the handle hold interact into the event input pin on this node. This ensures that we only trigger the interaction once and stop listening for further hold events until the next iteration cycle. Basically, we aren't checking the same thing over and over again for no reason. And with that, we're almost ready to play test our hold to interact functionality with the interaction system. But before we jump in, we actually want to go ahead and make some changes to how we wire up our IA interact wiring. So the first thing we want to do is actually disconnect the triggered execution pin on that node and then instead connect the started execution pin up to the begin interaction instead. What this will allow us to do is immediately begin interaction for single press interactions, but also immediately be able to hang off of that for our hold interactions as well. But we do also have some cleanup to do. So from the cancelled execution flow, drag out and add an unbind all events from onHold interact node, and then connect completed up to that as well. This ensures that as soon as the player releases the button, or the hold interaction finishes, we stop listening for further hold events. Basically, just for the sake of efficiency, there's no point in checking for things that the player isn't actually doing. So then the next thing we want to do is go ahead and tidy up this graph a little bit. I'm going to drag out towards the right and move things up inside this little space, but you can make yours look any way you want. And now if you hit compile, save, and then close back to the main editor and hit play, and then rock up to one of these doors and hold down the E key for over a second, you'll see that the door will open. And if you hold it again for over a second, it'll close, and you can keep doing that over and over again. But there is one thing. The progress bar is not currently working. And that's just because we haven't hooked up that divide node stuff that we did earlier on. So the next step is going to be going back and doing that. And to get started on that, the first thing we need to do is open up the BP player interaction state blueprint and add a new function. We're going to call that function update interaction percentage. And then the first thing we're going to want to do is set up a way for our game to tell us how long the player has been holding down the interaction button. So then select the entry point of the function here and then head on over to the right in the details panel and add a new input parameter. Name it percentage and set its type to float. Now we're going to be updating the progress for our active interactable. So head back over and drag in the active interactable variable to the graph and then make sure to choose get And then from that, you can just drag out and add an is valid check to ensure that we only run this next bit of logic if it's actually a valid target. Then we can just hook up the execution flow to make sure that the is valid check actually happens when this function is called. So now let's start hooking it all up. Let's drag another line out of our variable for active interactable and add a get component by class node. In the component class dropdown, select the BP underscore interactable class that we've written in previous videos in this series. And then from the return value of that, just drag out and add a get interaction prompt reference. And what this will do for us is give us the actual widget that is associated with our active interactable in our game. And then from that reference, you're actually going to be able to just drag out and then call the set progress function that we wrote inside of WBP underscore interaction prompt. Then make sure to hook up the is valid pin on the is valid check to the set progress node so that we update it only if everything is valid. Finally, go back to the start of this function and drag out from the percentage on the entry node and just connect it to the percentage pin on our set progress node. Now, whenever update interaction percentage is called with a value between 0 and 1, it'll update the progress bar on which interactable is currently active. But now we need to go and finish this up in our event graph. And on the event graph, just let's go back and locate the handle hold interact event that we completed earlier in this video, and then drag the update interaction percentage function that we just wrote into the graph and drop it in just before the existing branch node. And then go ahead and connect the execution pin from the handle hold interact event to the update interaction percentage so that it runs immediately when we receive the hold event. And then we can just grab everything from the branch node onwards and move it to the right to clear some space. Then we can just take some time to clear up this space and then drag out from the execution pin on the update interaction percentage node and hook it up to the branch node's execution so that the original logic for the hold done stuff still works. And now we can just take that output from the divide node that we added earlier in this video where we normalized our elapsed time and then drag its output pin to the percentage input pin on the update interaction percentage node. And what this is going to do is feed our player's interaction hold time to our update interaction percentage function. And then that's going to get fed to our interaction prompt widget on our active interactable. So it's going to be able to update as needed. And this is actually the feature completed, but we do want to go ahead and add some polish to this. So go to the far right of this piece of logic and after the unbind event from onHold interact node, drag out and call the update interaction percentage function again. But this time, go ahead and leave its percentage input unconnected so that it defaults to 0. And what this will do is reset the progress bar. So if you imagine after completion, it's going to open the door or it's going to fire some interaction or whatever. And then you want that interaction prompt to go back to 0 in case the player comes back and tries to interact again. And with that, we can actually just hit compile, save, close back to the main editor and hit play. And if you rock up to the door now, and hit the E key and hold it down, you'll see that that progress bar now moves all the way up and then resets and everything after it's been fired. And that's it. We are done for now. We have our hold interaction prompt completed. We have our little progress bar and everything. It's animated. It does everything it needs to do for a hold interaction type to work and work well within a video game. Now, I know it took me a long time to get this video out. It's actually quite a long one, and I also got really sick in the middle of making this video. I ended up getting surgery and everything, so it took me a while to actually get this video out, and I also had to balance my actual day job with it too. Now, I'm hoping to make the next few episodes of this a lot quicker. It shouldn't be taking me a month to output an episode at a time of this stuff, so Just bear with me. I'm going to keep adding more interaction types to this. And when we get it a little bit more completed, I'm going to actually open source it as well. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.